The rope chafed against Grace Pembroke's wrists as she stumbled through the dusty main street of Silverton, Colorado, a town that had once held promise, but now seemed determined to be her grave. The year was 1885, and the mountain mining town bustled with onlookers eager to witness what many were calling frontier justice. What Grace knew was nothing more than murder sanctioned by a corrupt judge and a false accusation. "Keep moving," growled Sheriff Tanner, the barrel of his revolver jabbing between her shoulder blades. His hand twisted in the fabric of her once fine blue dress, now stained with 3 days' worth of jail cell grime. The wooden gallows loomed at the end of the street, crude but effective, built specially for today's execution. Grace's throat constricted at the sight. 24 years of life had not prepared her for this end. The tears had dried hours ago when she realized no one would listen to her pleas of innocence. The banker, Edgar Holloway, had been found dead in his office with her handkerchief beside him, her initials embroidered in blue thread, evidence enough, according to Judge Wilson, to condemn her for murder. "I didn't kill him," Grace whispered hoarsely, more to herself than anyone around her. The crowd's murmurs grew louder as she passed, some faces filled with vindictive satisfaction, others with pity, but none with doubt. "You were seen entering his office," Sheriff Tanner replied mechanically, having heard her protests too many times over the past 3 days. "You were the last one with him. The handkerchief was stolen from me a week ago," she finished for him. "I told you, tell it to your maker," he cut her off, pushing her forward. Women clutched their children closer as Grace passed. Men removed their hats in grim recognition of the solemn proceedings. Grace searched the faces, hoping for a friendly one, but found none. Her sister had fled town weeks ago after their parents' death, and Grace had been alone ever since, working as a teacher in the small schoolhouse until the murder had upended her life. The gallows steps creaked under her weight. Each step brought her closer to her death, and she found her legs growing heavier, her body rebelling against what her mind had already accepted. The noose dangled, swaying slightly in the mountain breeze that carried the scent of pine and gunpowder. Sheriff Tanner positioned her on the trapdoor, his weathered face betraying no emotion as he reached for the noose. Judge Wilson stood nearby, his portly frame draped in a black coat despite the summer heat, watching with detached interest like a man observing an unremarkable card game. "Grace Pembroke," he began, unrolling a small parchment, "you have been found guilty of the murder of Edgar Holloway, a respected citizen of Silverton. Do you have any last words before the sentence is carried out?" Grace opened her mouth, but the words died in her throat as a commotion erupted at the far end of the street. The crowd parted reluctantly, turning to identify the source of the disturbance. A horse's whinny cut through the murmurs, followed by the thundering of hooves on packed dirt. "Stop!" The voice rang out clear and commanding, causing even Sheriff Tanner's hands to freeze on the noose. "Stop the execution!" A bay stallion galloped into view, its rider leaning forward in the saddle, pushing the animal to its limits. The man pulled hard on the reins, bringing the horse to a sliding halt that kicked up a cloud of dust at the foot of the gallows. His Stetson was pulled low over his eyes, but there was no mistaking the determination in his stance as he dismounted in one fluid motion. "This execution cannot proceed," he announced, striding forward with purpose, ignoring the sheriff's drawn weapon. "I have proof that Grace Pembroke is innocent." Grace's heart stuttered in her chest as she recognized the man. Riley Adams, the cattle rancher whose land bordered Silverton to the west. She had met him only in passing, exchanged pleasantries when he'd visited the schoolhouse to deliver books his late mother had donated. He'd been polite but distant, a man of few words with eyes that seemed to see more than he let on. "Riley Adams," Sheriff Tanner acknowledged with a scowl. "This is official business. Stand down or I'll have you arrested for interference." "I'll stand down when you release an innocent woman," Riley replied, reaching into his saddlebag to retrieve a leather portfolio. "I have evidence that proves Grace Pembroke couldn't have killed Edgar Holloway." Judge Wilson's face darkened. "This is highly irregular, Mr. Adams." "The trial is over," the verdict rendered. "A trial that lasted less than an hour," Riley shot back, "with no witnesses called for the defense and no investigation beyond finding a handkerchief." Grace felt a surge of hope, wild and dangerous, as Riley approached the gallows. His eyes met hers briefly, blue as the Colorado sky, and in them she saw a promise. She wasn't alone anymore. "The law is the law," Sheriff Tanner said, but his voice lacked conviction. "Then follow it properly," Riley countered, climbing the gallows steps despite the sheriff's protests. He handed the portfolio to Judge Wilson, who reluctantly took it. "These are bank documents. Holloway was embezzling from his clients. He was seen arguing with Harvey Coleman the day of his murder, not with Miss Pembroke." Judge Wilson's eyes narrowed as he flipped through the papers. "Where did you get these?" "From Holloway's private safe. I had dealings with the man. He kept a second set of books, the real records." Riley stood his ground, not intimidated by the judge or the sheriff. "Coleman discovered the theft and confronted Holloway. He's fled town, but not before planting evidence against Miss Pembroke." "How convenient that you've come by this information just as the hangman's ready," Sheriff Tanner said suspiciously. "I've been tracking Coleman for 3 days. Found him in Durango last night, drunk and bragging about how he'd framed that schoolteacher for his crime." Riley pulled another paper from his coat. "I have his signed confession. The territorial marshal witnessed it. Grace's legs nearly gave out beneath her. 3 days of despair, of preparing for death, and now this moment of potential salvation had arrived in the form of a taciturn cattleman she barely knew." Judge Wilson examined the confession, his expression souring as he read. The crowd grew restless, murmurs turning to shouts as word spread of the new evidence. "Remove the noose," the judge finally ordered, his voice clipped with barely contained frustration. "It appears there has been a miscarriage of justice." Sheriff Tanner hesitated, clearly unhappy with the turn of events, but complied. The rough hemp slid away from Grace's neck, and she drew her first full breath in what felt like days. As her bound hands were freed, she rubbed at the raw skin of her wrists, still unable to fully believe her reprieve. "Miss Pembroke is released from custody," Judge Wilson announced to the crowd. "The court will review this new evidence and issue warrants for Harvey Coleman." The crowd's reaction was mixed, some disappointed at being denied the spectacle of an execution, others relieved that an innocent woman had been saved. Grace paid them no mind. Her focus remained on Riley Adams, the man who had appeared like an avenging angel at the moment of her greatest need. "Thank you," she whispered as he helped her down the gallows steps, her legs unsteady. "How did you know?" "I didn't," he admitted quietly. "Not until 3 nights ago when Coleman started drinking and talking at the Silver Dollar, but I always thought the evidence against you was too convenient." "Too neat. Why would you care?" Grace asked, genuinely puzzled. "We've barely spoken." Riley's expression softened slightly, revealing a glimpse of the man beneath the stoic exterior. "I've seen you with the children at the schoolhouse. Heard how you stayed late to help the Wilkins boy learn his letters. A woman like that doesn't turn around and murder a man in cold blood." Before Grace could respond, a commotion broke out near the bank. Sheriff Tanner was arguing loudly with Emmett Blackwell, one of the bank's directors and Judge Wilson's brother-in-law. Their heated exchange drew attention away from Grace and Riley. "Come on," Riley said, taking her elbow gently. "Let's get you somewhere safe. This isn't over." The certainty in his voice sent a chill down Grace's spine. "What do you mean?" "Coleman didn't act alone," Riley explained, guiding her toward his horse. "Holloway's embezzlement scheme involved others in town, powerful men who won't appreciate being exposed." As if to confirm his words, Sheriff Tanner glanced their way, his hand moving to rest on his holstered pistol. The threat was unmistakable. "My things," Grace began, thinking of the few possessions she had left in her small room above the milliner's shop. "We'll send for them later," Riley assured her. "Right now, we need to leave Silverton." With surprising strength, he lifted her onto his horse before mounting behind her. His arms created a protective cage around her as he took the reins. "Hold on," he instructed. And then they were moving, the horse responding to Riley's commands as they rode down the main street, past stunned onlookers and through the edge of town toward the mountains beyond. Grace's mind whirled with questions, but the immediacy of escape pushed them aside. The wind caught her hair, pulling it from the simple bun the jailer's wife had arranged that morning in a small act of kindness before her scheduled execution. She felt Riley's solid presence behind her, steady and reassuring as they left Silverton behind. They rode for hours, following trails that wound through aspen groves and climbed rocky slopes. The summer sun beat down, but the higher elevation kept the heat bearable. Riley said little, occasionally pointing out landmarks or warning her to duck beneath low-hanging branches. Grace was acutely aware of his proximity, of the arm that occasionally steadied her when the trail grew treacherous. By late afternoon, they crested a ridge that offered a view of a valley below, nestled between towering peaks. A ranch house stood in a clearing, surrounded by fenced pastures where cattle grazed. Outbuildings dotted the property, and a creek wound through the land, catching the sunlight like scattered diamonds. "My place," Riley said simply. "We'll be safe here." As they descended into the valley, Grace realized she had entered a new chapter in her life, one that had nearly ended on the gallows, but had somehow been granted a reprieve. And the man responsible for that reprieve was a mystery she intended to solve. The ranch house was larger than it had appeared from a distance, built of sturdy logs with a wide porch wrapping around two sides. A woman emerged as they approached, gray-haired and wiry, her expression shifting from concern to curiosity as she spotted Grace. "Mrs. Hawkins," Riley called out as he dismounted. "We have a guest who will be staying with us for a while." "I can see that," the woman replied dryly. "And judging by the state of her dress and your urgent departure this morning, I'm guessing there's a story here." Riley helped Grace down, his hands lingering at her waist a moment longer than necessary. "Miss Pembroke nearly hanged for a murder she didn't commit. I intervened." Mrs. Hawkins's eyebrows rose. "I see. Well, Miss Pembroke, you look like you could use a hot bath and a decent meal. Come inside." "Thank you," Grace said, finding her voice at last. The events of the day had left her physically and emotionally drained, but the housekeeper's matter-of-fact acceptance was oddly comforting. "Riley, Thomas will want to know you're back," Mrs. Hawkins added. "He's out checking the north pasture with the men." Riley nodded. "I'll find him after I settle Miss Pembroke." He guided Grace toward the house, his hand resting lightly on the small of her back. "Mrs. Hawkins has been with my family since before I was born. She runs the house and keeps us all in line." Grace managed a small smile. "She seems formidable. You have no idea." There was genuine affection in Riley's voice. "She'll look after you while I tend to some business. You'll be safe here, Miss Pembroke." "Grace," she corrected him. "After what you've done for me, I think we can dispense with formalities." Something flickered in his eyes, surprise, perhaps, or pleasure. "Grace, then." He said her name carefully, as if testing how it felt on his tongue. The inside of the ranch house was unexpectedly refined. Polished wood floors gleamed beneath quality rugs. The furniture was solid and well crafted, not ostentatious but certainly indicating prosperity. Bookshelves lined one wall of the main room, filled with volumes that made Grace's fingers itch to explore them. "My mother's influence," Riley explained, noticing her interest. "She believed that just because we live on the frontier doesn't mean we should live like savages." "She sounds like a wise woman." She was. The simple past tense spoke volumes. Riley cleared his throat. "Mrs. Hawkins will show you to a room where you can rest and clean up. I've kept you in the saddle too long today." "Mr. Adams, Riley," Grace amended, reaching out to touch his arm. "I don't know how to thank you. You saved my life today." He covered her hand with his own briefly. "You don't need to thank me for doing what's right." Then, with a nod to Mrs. Hawkins, he was gone, striding out the door toward the stables. Mrs. Hawkins clicked her tongue. "That boy, always rushing off." She gestured for Grace to follow her. "Come along, Miss Pembroke, let's get you settled." As Grace followed the housekeeper up a staircase to the second floor, she couldn't help glancing back toward the door where Riley had disappeared. The man was an enigma, stern and reserved one moment, gentle and thoughtful the next, and he had risked everything to save a woman he barely knew. For the first time since Sheriff Tanner had dragged her from the schoolhouse 3 days ago, Grace felt something other than fear and despair. It was a fragile thing, this new feeling, part gratitude, part curiosity, and part something else she wasn't quite ready to name. "Here we are, Mrs. Hawkins announced, opening a door to reveal a pleasant bedroom with a large window overlooking the valley. "The bathroom is across the hall. I'll have hot water brought up for you." "This is lovely," Grace said, genuinely touched by the comfortable accommodations after the squalor of the jail cell. "Riley's mother's room," Mrs. Hawkins explained. "Been empty these past 2 years since she passed. He keeps it ready for guests, though we don't get many." Grace ran her hand over the quilt that covered the bed, pieced together in a pattern of stars. "I hate to impose." "Nonsense. You're not imposing if you were invited." Mrs. Hawkins fixed her with a penetrating look. "Now, while the boys bring up that water, why don't you tell me the real story of how you ended up nearly hanging, and why Riley Adams rode hell for leather to save you?" Grace sank onto the edge of the bed, suddenly overwhelmed by the need to share the burden of her experience with someone who might understand. "It started 3 days ago," she began, and found that once she started talking, the words poured out of her like a dam breaking. "Mrs. Hawkins listened without interrupting, her weathered face revealing nothing as Grace recounted the events leading to her arrest, finding Holloway dead in his office when she'd gone to discuss a loan for new school books, the discovery of her handkerchief, the hasty trial where no one believed her claims of innocence. And then today, just as they were about to hang me, Riley appeared with proof that Harvey Coleman was the real killer," Grace concluded. "I still don't understand how he knew to look for evidence, or why he would go to such lengths for me." Mrs. Hawkins nodded thoughtfully. "Riley's got a powerful sense of justice. Gets it from his father. Old man Adams was known for standing up against the cattle barons when they tried to run small ranchers out of the valley. Is his father—" Grace let the question hang. "Passed on 5 years ago. Left Riley the ranch at 23. He's built it up since then, made it one of the most successful operations in the territory." Mrs. Hawkins stood as a knock sounded at the door. "That'll be your bath water. We'll talk more over supper. Riley will want to know you're settling in." After Mrs. Hawkins left, Grace sank into the promised bath, letting the hot water wash away the jail's filth and some of the day's trauma. She scrubbed until her skin was pink, washed her hair twice, and finally emerged feeling somewhat restored. Mrs. Hawkins had left a dress on the bed, simple but clean, obviously belonging to a woman smaller than Grace, as the hem ended above her ankles. It was Riley's mother's, Mrs. Hawkins explained when Grace came downstairs. You're taller than she was, but it'll do until we can get your things from town. The kitchen was warm and fragrant with the smell of roasting meat and baking bread. Grace's stomach growled embarrassingly loud, reminding her that she'd barely eaten in days. Sit, Mrs. Hawkins instructed, pointing to a chair at the large wooden table. You need feeding up. Grace had just taken her seat when the back door opened, and Riley entered, accompanied by a younger man who bore enough of a resemblance to mark him as family. Both men had removed their hats, and Riley's dark hair was damp with sweat, curling slightly at the nape of his neck. Thomas, this is Miss Grace Pembroke, Riley said. Grace, my younger brother Thomas. Thomas Adams stepped forward with an easy smile that contrasted sharply with his brother's reserve. Miss Pembroke, Riley's told me about your ordeal. I'm glad he was able to help. So am I, Grace replied sincerely. I owe him my life. Riley made a dismissive gesture. You don't owe me anything. He caught Mrs. Hawkins's stern look and added, but you're welcome to stay here as long as you need. Thank you, Grace said. I won't impose for long. Once it's safe to return to town, that may not be any time soon, Riley interrupted, taking a seat across from her. Coleman was working with someone with influence. Until we know who, Silverton isn't safe for you. Thomas whistled low. You think someone high up was involved in Holloway's embezzlement? I know it, Riley confirmed. The numbers in those books were too big for just a small town banker and a drifter like Coleman. Someone with connections was moving that money. Mrs. Hawkins set plates of roast beef, potatoes, and greens in front of them. Eat first, conspiracies later, she ordered, and no one dared argue. Grace hadn't realized how hungry she was until she took the first bite. The food was simple but delicious, and she had to remind herself to eat slowly, like the lady her parents had raised her to be, not the starving prisoner she'd been hours earlier. Mrs. Hawkins mentioned your mother had passed, Grace said after a while, wanting to shift the conversation away from her troubles. I'm sorry for your loss. Riley nodded, his expression softening slightly. Consumption took her 2 winters ago. She loved this place, though it wasn't the life she was raised for. She came from Boston, married my father for love despite her family's objections. She sounds brave. She was. Pride colored his voice. Taught school before she married like you. Always believed education was important, even out here. Is that why you donated her books to the schoolhouse? Grace asked. Riley met her eyes. She would have wanted them used, not gathering dust here. Thomas chuckled. That's not the only reason he rode into town with those books. Riley shot his brother a warning look that only made Thomas's grin widen. My brother's been finding excuses to visit Silverton ever since you took over teaching last fall, Miss Pembroke. Those books were just the most recent pretext. Color rose in Riley's face, and Grace felt her own cheeks warm. She recalled the few times Riley had come to the schoolhouse always polite, always finding some reason to linger, asking about the children's progress, or offering to fix a loose floorboard or a sticking window. I appreciate your interest in education, Grace said diplomatically, though her heart had begun to beat a little faster. It's not the education he's interested in, Thomas muttered, earning himself a kick under the table from his brother. Mrs. Hawkins saved Riley from further embarrassment by bringing apple pie to the table. That's enough teasing, Thomas. Let the poor girl eat in peace. She's had a trying day. The conversation shifted to ranch business, giving Grace time to process this new information. Had Riley Adams really been finding excuses to see her? The thought was both flattering and confusing. If he'd had an interest in her, why had he never made it known? After dinner, Riley suggested they talk in the study. Grace followed him to a comfortable room lined with more books and furnished with a large desk and several leather armchairs. A map of Colorado Territory hung on one wall, marked with pencil notes indicating property boundaries. "You should know everything," Riley began, gesturing for her to sit. "About Coleman, the embezzlement, and why you were framed." Grace settled into a chair. "I've been wondering why anyone would choose me as a scapegoat. I'm not important in Silverton." "You're new enough that you don't have deep ties to the community," Riley explained, pacing slowly. "Respectable enough that your arrest would cause a sensation, but not wealthy or connected enough to mount a serious defense. The perfect target. But why kill Holloway in the first place, if they were working together? Holloway got greedy, started skimming from the operation." Riley paused by the window, looking out at the darkening valley. "Coleman was just a hireling, probably sent to silence Holloway and create a convenient distraction with your arrest. And you think someone in Silverton was behind it all? Someone with power?" Riley nodded grimly. "The Territorial Bank Examiner was due next month. Holloway couldn't hide the discrepancies anymore. Someone stood to lose a lot if the scheme was exposed." "Judge Wilson," Grace said suddenly, remembering the man's reluctance to examine the evidence Riley had presented. "He seemed unusually eager for my conviction." "He's on my list of suspects," Riley agreed, "along with Mayor Burton and Emmett Blackwell from the bank's board." "What are you going to do?" Riley turned to face her, his expression determined. "Find proof of who was really behind it all. Coleman's confession implicates his employer but doesn't name names. I need more evidence before I can take this to the territorial authorities. And until then, you stay here where it's safe." His tone brooked no argument. "I've already sent word to the marshal in Denver about what happened today. He'll be watching the situation in Silverton." Grace stood, approaching Riley at the window. "I can't hide forever. Those children at the school need their teacher." "They need their teacher alive," Riley countered. "Once we've exposed the mastermind behind the scheme, you can return to your life. Until then, I'm not risking your safety." His protectiveness should have felt stifling, but instead, Grace found it oddly comforting. No one had looked out for her so fiercely since her parents died. "And what if we never find proof?" Riley's gaze was steady. "Then I'll take you wherever you want to go. Denver, San Francisco, even back east if that's what you prefer. But I won't let you walk back into danger." The conviction in his voice made something flutter in Grace's chest. "Why do you care so much what happens to me?" For a moment, he didn't answer, and in the lengthening silence, Grace thought she might have overstepped. Then Riley reached out, his fingers brushing a strand of hair from her face with unexpected gentleness. "Because from the first moment I saw you teaching those children, with patience and kindness despite their dirty faces and tattered clothes, I knew you were someone special." His hand fell away, but his eyes remained on hers. "Someone worth protecting." Grace's breath caught. No man had ever spoken to her with such sincerity, such raw honesty. "Riley." A sharp knock at the front door interrupted whatever she might have said. Riley's posture immediately tensed, his hand moving to the revolver at his hip. "Stay here," he instructed, moving swiftly to the study door. Grace followed despite his directive, her curiosity overriding caution. In the main room, Thomas was already at the door, shotgun in hand. "Who's there?" Thomas called. "Jim Harper," came the reply. "From town, got a message for Riley Adams." Riley nodded to his brother, who unbolted the door while keeping the shotgun visible. A young man stood on the porch, hat in hand, looking nervous. "Mr. Adams, Sheriff Tanner's issued a warrant for your arrest," Harper blurted out. "Says you interfered with justice and helped a fugitive escape." Riley's expression hardened. "Miss Pembroke was legally released by Judge Wilson. Judge changed his mind after you left," Harper explained. "Says the evidence you presented was obtained illegally and doesn't change the verdict." Thomas swore colorfully. "That's horseshit and you know it, Jim." Harper shifted uncomfortably. "I'm just delivering the message. Sheriff's forming a posse to ride out here at first light. Thought you should have warning on account of your father helping my family during the drought years." "I appreciate the risk you took," Riley said. "You'd better get back before you're missed." After Harper left, Riley turned to find Grace standing in the doorway, her face pale with renewed fear. "They can't do this," she whispered. "They can't just ignore evidence and declare me guilty again." "They can if they're desperate to cover their tracks," Riley replied grimly, "which means we've scared someone badly." Thomas secured the door. "What's the plan, Riley? We can't fight off the whole town." Riley thought for a moment, his mind working through options. "We need to get Grace somewhere safe, then gather more evidence. I have a friend in Durango who's a lawyer. He can help file appeals with the territorial court." "The line shack in the high country," Thomas suggested. "No one knows about it except our men, and they're loyal," Riley nodded. "You'll take her there tonight. I'll follow after I gather what we need from town." "No," Grace protested. "I won't let you put yourself in danger because of me. If you go to Silverton now, they'll arrest you." "They'll try," Riley corrected her, a ghost of a smile touching his lips. "I know ways into town they don't. And I need to retrieve your personal items and speak to a few people who might know more about Holloway's dealings." Grace wanted to argue further, but the determined set of Riley's jaw told her it would be futile. He had already made up his mind to protect her, whatever the cost. "Promise me you'll be careful," she said instead. Riley's expression softened. "I promise. And when this is over, we'll have a proper conversation about everything." The unspoken things between them hung in the air, possibilities that had begun to form during their brief time together. Grace nodded, understanding that now was not the time, but that there would be a time if they survived the coming days. As Thomas went to prepare horses for their night ride, and Mrs. Hawkins hurried to pack food and supplies, Riley took Grace's hand in his. "Trust me," he said simply. And despite knowing him for less than a day, despite the danger surrounding them, Grace found that she did. Completely. The line shack was primitive but secure, nestled in a hidden valley high in the mountains where the Adams Ranch kept cattle during summer grazing. The single-room cabin had a stone fireplace, a rough wooden table with 2 chairs, a narrow bed built into one wall, and shelves stocked with basic provisions. Thomas helped Grace settle in, showed her how to bar the door, and promised Riley would arrive by noon the next day. "What if he doesn't come?" Grace asked, voicing her deepest fear. Thomas's confidence never wavered. "He'll come. My brother's the most stubborn man in Colorado territory. Once he sets his mind to something or someone, nothing stops him." With that reassurance, Thomas departed, leaving Grace alone with her thoughts in the remote cabin. She stoked the fire against the mountain chill, wrapped herself in a blanket, and waited, watching the stars through the single window and praying for Riley's safety. Dawn broke with golden light spilling over the mountain peaks. Grace had dozed fitfully in the chair by the fire, starting awake at every sound from the forest outside. She made coffee from the provisions Thomas had left, grateful for the warmth and stimulation of the bitter brew. By mid-morning, her nerves were stretched thin with waiting. She paced the small cabin, reciting poetry to keep her mind occupied, occasionally peering out the window for any sign of Riley's approach. When she heard hoofbeats on the trail, her heart leapt, then plummeted as she realized there were multiple riders, not just one. Grabbing the rifle Thomas had left for her, Grace positioned herself beside the window, peering cautiously around the edge of the curtain. Relief flooded through her when she recognized Riley in the lead, followed by two other men she didn't know. She unbarred the door as they dismounted, rushing out to meet them. Riley looked exhausted, with dark circles under his eyes and a day's worth of stubble shadowing his jaw, but he was alive and unharmed. "You're safe," she breathed, resisting the urge to throw her arms around him. Riley offered a tired smile. "I promised, didn't I?" he gestured to his companions. "This is Marshal Daniel Grant from the Denver office, and Peter Finch, territorial prosecutor. They need to hear your story, Grace." Inside the cabin, Grace recounted everything from discovering Holloway's body to her arrest, trial, and near execution. Marshal Grant took notes, occasionally asking for clarification, while Finch listened with a prosecutor's analytical attention. "Miss Pembroke, your account matches the evidence Mr. Adams has gathered," Grant said when she finished. "Combined with Coleman's confession and the financial records, we have enough to issue arrest warrants for Judge Wilson and Mayor Burton." Riley, who had been standing by the door, added, "I spoke with the bank teller, Sarah Miller, last night. She confirmed that Wilson and Burton both had regular private meetings with Holloway. She also saw Burton arguing with Holloway the morning of the murder." "What about Sheriff Tanner?" Grace asked. "He was eager enough to hang me." Finch nodded grimly. "Tanner appears to have been following orders rather than actively participating in the embezzlement. He'll face consequences for obstruction of justice, but our main targets are Wilson and Burton." "What happens now?" Grace looked to Riley for answers. "Marshal Grant has telegraphed for additional lawmen," Riley explained. "They'll intercept Tanner's posse and then proceed to Silverton to make arrests. You and I will remain here until it's safe." The marshal and prosecutor didn't stay long, eager to return to their duties. Before leaving, Grant assured Grace that her name would be fully cleared, and that she could resume her teaching position once the situation was resolved. When they were alone again, Riley slumped into a chair, the exhaustion of the past day finally catching up with him. "You should rest," Grace told him, concern evident in her voice. "You look ready to collapse." "I'll be fine," he insisted, though his eyelids were already drooping. "Just need to stay alert in case the territorial marshal and prosecutor fail in their duties," Grace interrupted gently. "I think we're safe for now. Please, Riley, rest." Too tired to argue, he allowed her to guide him to the bed. He was asleep almost before his head touched the pillow, one hand still clutching his revolver. Grace carefully removed the weapon, placing it within easy reach, then covered him with a blanket. For a long moment, she simply watched him sleep, studying the face of the man who had risked everything for her. In repose, the stern lines of his face softened, making him appear younger, more vulnerable. Grace resisted the impulse to brush the dark hair from his forehead, not wanting to disturb his well-earned rest. Instead, she busied herself around the cabin, preparing a simple meal from the provisions and tidying the already neat space. The domesticity of these tasks soothed her, providing a brief illusion of normalcy amid the chaos their lives had become. Riley slept for hours, not stirring until late afternoon when the angle of sunlight through the window had shifted to cast long shadows across the cabin floor. He woke all at once, sitting up with a start, hand reaching for his missing gun. "It's here," Grace said, indicating the revolver on the table beside a steaming cup of coffee. "Everything's quiet, No sign of trouble. Riley rubbed his face, visibly reorienting himself. How long was I asleep? 6 hours, give or take. She handed him the coffee. You needed it. He accepted the cup with a nod of thanks, taking a long sip before speaking again. I should have been keeping watch. I've been watching, Grace assured him. Though I'm not sure what I would have done if trouble arrived, beyond shooting wildly in its general direction. That drew a smile from him, transforming his face in a way that made Grace's heart skip. You're braver than you give yourself credit for. Not brave, she demurred. Just stubborn about staying alive. Stubbornness is an underrated virtue in these parts. Riley set aside his empty cup and stood, stretching muscles stiff from sleep and hard riding. Speaking of staying alive, I brought your things from town. He retrieved a carpet bag from beside the door, one Grace recognized as her own. How did you manage that? Surely my boarding house was watched. Mrs. Miller from the millinery shop packed it for you. Said to tell you she never believed you were guilty, and she's keeping your room ready for when you return. Riley handed her the bag. I slipped in through the back while the sheriff was organizing his posse in the saloon. Grace clutched the bag to her chest, unexpectedly moved by this tangible connection to her interrupted life. Thank you for everything. Riley waved off her gratitude. I also brought food that doesn't come from a can. He produced a cloth-wrapped bundle that proved to contain bread, cheese, and dried apple slices, humble fare that nonetheless felt like a feast after the basic provisions of the line shack. They ate together at the small table as dusk gathered outside, sharing the simple meal and speaking of inconsequential things: the weather, the quality of the coffee, the view from the cabin's single window. It was as if, by unspoken agreement, they had decided to postpone discussion of more weighty matters until their immediate crisis had passed. After they had eaten, Riley checked his pocket watch. The marshal should have reached Silverton by now. With luck, Wilson and Burton are already in custody. And if not, then we remain here until they are. He met her eyes steadily. I won't risk your safety, Grace, not after everything that's happened. I'm not afraid, she said, surprised to discover it was true. Not anymore, not with you. Something shifted in Riley's expression, a softening around his eyes that matched the gentle way he reached across the table to take her hand. When I heard they'd arrested you for Holloway's murder, I knew it couldn't be true. Not just because you're a good person, but because I'd been watching Holloway for months. Watching him. Grace's brow furrowed in confusion. My father taught me to pay attention to people's patterns. Holloway's pattern changed last year, suddenly taking trips to Denver every month. Buying expensive gifts for women who weren't his wife, living beyond the means of a small-town banker. Riley's thumb traced small circles on the back of her hand as he spoke. I started looking into his business dealings because something felt wrong. You were investigating him before I was even accused, Grace realized. That's how you knew where to look for evidence. Riley nodded. I was close to figuring it out when you were arrested. Coleman's drunken boasting just confirmed what I already suspected. Why didn't you come forward sooner? Before they put me on trial, I tried, Riley admitted, regret coloring his voice. Judge Wilson refused to see me. Sheriff Tanner said my suspicions weren't evidence. By the time I gathered proof that would stand up in court, they'd already sentenced you. Grace squeezed his hand. You came when it mattered most. I almost didn't make it in time, he said, his voice rough with emotion, when I rode into town and saw the gallows. He couldn't finish the sentence. Grace rose from her chair, moving around the table without releasing his hand. She knelt beside him, looking up into his troubled face. But you did make it. You saved my life, Riley Adams. His free hand came up to cradle her cheek, his touch reverent. I couldn't bear the thought of losing you before I even had the chance to know you." The confession hung between them, honest and vulnerable in a way that touched Grace deeply. This stern, reserved man had opened himself to her, showing a heart that matched his formidable courage. "Then know me," she whispered, rising to meet him as he bent toward her. Their first kiss was gentle, tentative, a question asked and answered in the press of lips, and the subtle tightening of fingers entwined together. When they parted, Riley's eyes searched hers, looking for confirmation that she felt the same unexpected connection that had drawn him to risk everything for her. What he saw must have satisfied him, for he smiled a full, genuine smile that transformed his face completely. "Grace Pembroke," he said softly, "when this is all over, would you allow me to court you properly?" Grace laughed, the sound bright with relief and joy. "After everything we've been through together, I think we're well beyond the need for conventional courtship." "Nevertheless," Riley insisted, his sense of propriety reasserting itself, "your reputation has suffered enough because of false accusations. I won't add to that burden." His consideration touched her deeply. In a world where women's reputations were fragile things easily shattered, Riley's concern demonstrated a respect that many men lacked. "Very well," she agreed, her smile turning mischievous. "You may court me properly after I've been fully exonerated and returned to my position." "Done." His eyes crinkled at the corners as he sealed their agreement with another kiss, this one less hesitant than the first. A sharp knock at the door shattered the moment, sending both of them reaching for weapons. Riley motioned for Grace to stand behind him as he approached the door, gun drawn. "Who's there?" he called. "Thomas," came the reply, followed by a coded phrase the brothers had arranged. "Eagle's Nest is empty." Riley relaxed visibly, unbarring the door to admit his brother. Thomas entered with a broad grin, removing his hat with a flourish. "It's over," he announced triumphantly. "Marshal Grant arrested Wilson and Burton this afternoon. Both are headed to Denver to stand trial. Sheriff Tanner's been temporarily relieved of duty pending investigation, and the territorial governor has appointed an interim judge to review all of Wilson's recent cases." "Coleman?" Riley asked. "Singing like a canary in the Denver jail," Thomas confirmed. "The whole embezzlement scheme is exposed. They were using the bank to launder money from land fraud all across the territory." Relief washed over Grace, so powerful that her knees nearly buckled. Riley steadied her with a hand at her elbow, his touch grounding her as the implications sank in. "I'm free," she whispered. "Truly free." "And publicly exonerated," Thomas added. "Marshal Grant made a point of announcing your innocence to the whole town. Your teaching position is waiting whenever you're ready to return." Riley's hand tightened on her arm. "There's no rush," he said, his tone casual but his eyes intent on her face. "You've been through an ordeal. Take whatever time you need." Grace understood the unspoken question. Was she ready to return to Silverton, to the scene of her humiliation and near death? Or would she prefer to start fresh elsewhere? "I'd like to go back," she decided. "Those children need their teacher, and I won't let fear drive me away from the life I've built." Riley nodded, pride evident in his expression. "Whenever you're ready, I'll take you." Thomas glanced between them, a knowing smile spreading across his face. "I see you two have been talking while I've been away." Grace felt heat rise to her cheeks, but Riley merely raised an eyebrow at his brother. "As a matter of fact, we have. I've asked Miss Pembroke's permission to court her properly once she's settled back in Silverton." "Court her?" Thomas laughed. "Brother, you've already rescued her from the gallows and hidden her from the law. I'd say you're well past courting and headed straight for the altar." "Thomas," Riley admonished, though there was no real anger in his tone. Grace intervened before the brothers could begin bickering in earnest. "Perhaps we should return to the ranch for tonight. I could use a proper bed and Mrs. Hawkins's cooking before deciding my next steps." Both men agreed readily to this sensible suggestion. As they rode down from the mountains toward the Adams Ranch, Grace found herself reflecting on the extraordinary turn her life had taken in just 2 days. From condemned prisoner to exonerated woman. From lonely schoolteacher to the object of Riley Adams's affection. The future, which had seemed so brutally foreshortened on the gallows, now stretched before her with unexpected promise. 2 months later, Grace stood before her students in the freshly painted Silverton schoolhouse, watching with satisfaction as they bent their heads over their arithmetic exercises. Her return to teaching had been met with mixed reactions from the townsfolk, some embarrassed by their rush to judgment, others genuinely relieved to see justice done. A few still regarded her with suspicion, but Grace found she could bear their doubtful glances with newfound strength. The trials of Wilson and Burton had begun in Denver, with Grace scheduled to testify the following week. The evidence against them was substantial, bolstered by Coleman's testimony and the financial records Riley had discovered. Few in town now doubted her innocence, especially after several of Holloway's clients discovered they too had been victims of his embezzlement scheme. A movement at the schoolhouse door caught her attention. Riley stood in the entrance, hat in hand, waiting patiently for her to notice him. In the weeks since her ordeal, he had been true to his word, courting her with formal visits, chaperoned rides, and small, thoughtful gifts that demonstrated his growing understanding of her character and preferences. Grace nodded to her eldest student to continue monitoring the class, then stepped outside to greet him. "Mr. Adams," she said with a smile, consciously maintaining propriety in sight of the schoolhouse windows. "This is a pleasant surprise." "Miss Pembroke," he replied, matching her formal tone though his eyes danced with private warmth. "I wondered if you might join me for supper this evening at the hotel. Mrs. Hawkins has come to town for supplies and has agreed to act as chaperone." "I'd be delighted," Grace accepted. Their courtship had progressed steadily, deepening with each conversation and shared experience. Riley had proven to be not just brave and principled, but thoughtful, intelligent, and possessed of a dry wit that emerged when he was truly comfortable. "I'll call for you at 6, he said, then added in a lower voice, "I've something important to discuss." The hint of nervousness in his normally confident manner sent a flutter of anticipation through Grace's chest. "I'll be ready." That evening, dressed in her best blue gown, a new one, ordered from Denver after her return to Silverton, Grace met Riley at her boarding house door. He looked handsome in a dark suit, his usually windswept hair tamed for the occasion, his face freshly shaved. Mrs. Hawkins accompanied them to the hotel dining room, maintaining a discreet distance that provided the illusion of privacy while satisfying the demands of propriety. The meal was pleasant, their conversation flowing easily, but Grace could sense Riley's underlying tension. Finally, as they lingered over coffee and apple pie, he reached into his pocket and placed a small velvet box on the table between them. "Grace," he began, his voice steady despite the emotion evident in his eyes. "2 months ago, I rode into town because I couldn't bear the thought of an innocent woman being executed. I had no idea that day would change my life completely." Grace's heart began to race as she realized what was happening. Around them, other diners had fallen silent, watching the scene unfold. "I've come to admire your courage, your intelligence, and your determination," Riley continued. "Every day I spend with you confirms what I suspected from the beginning, that you are the most remarkable woman I've ever known. He opened the box, revealing a ring with a modest but brilliant diamond set in gold. "I know our beginning was unusual, but I hope our future together will be long and filled with happiness. Grace Pembroke, would you do me the honor of becoming my wife?" The directness of the proposal was so characteristic of Riley, no flowery language or excessive sentiment, just honest emotion and sincere intent. Grace found herself blinking back tears as she looked from the ring to his hopeful face. "Yes," she said simply. "Yes, Riley, I will marry you." He slipped the ring onto her finger as the dining room erupted in applause. Even Mrs. Hawkins was wiping away a suspiciously moist eye as Riley leaned across the table to kiss his new fiancée, propriety be damned. "When?" Grace asked after the congratulations had been offered, and the attention of their fellow diners had returned to their own meals. "As soon as you're willing," Riley replied. "After the trial, perhaps. A fresh start once that chapter is closed." Grace nodded. "A fresh start sounds perfect." The trial concluded in Denver 3 weeks later with the conviction of both Wilson and Burton on multiple counts of fraud, embezzlement, and in Burton's case, conspiracy to commit murder. Grace's testimony had been brief but crucial, and she left the courthouse feeling as though a weight had been lifted from her shoulders. Riley, who had remained by her side throughout the proceedings, squeezed her hand as they descended the courthouse steps. "It's truly over now." "Yes," Grace agreed, "and our beginning can finally start." They were married the following Saturday in the Adams Ranch house, with Thomas serving as best man and Mrs. Hawkins sniffling proudly in the front row. The ceremony was simple but meaningful, attended by friends from both Silverton and the ranch. Afterward, as they danced under lantern light on the wide porch, Riley held Grace close and whispered, "I never expected to find love on the day I rode to stop an execution." Grace smiled up at her husband, remembering the terror of the gallows and the miraculous appearance of the man who now held her in his arms. "Sometimes love finds us in the most unexpected places, or at the most unexpected times," Riley added, bending to kiss her as the music swelled around them. 1 year later, Grace stood on the porch of the ranch house, watching as Riley taught their infant son to ride by bouncing him gently on his knee. Little James, named for Riley's father, squealed with delight, his chubby hands clutching at his father's shirt for balance. The past year had brought changes to both their lives. Grace had continued teaching in Silverton until her pregnancy became advanced, then transitioned to tutoring the children of neighboring ranchers from the Adams home. Riley had expanded the ranch operations, hiring more men and increasing their cattle herd, while also accepting a position on the Territorial Commission overseeing banking regulations, a role created in direct response to the Holloway embezzlement scandal. Thomas had recently become engaged to Sarah Miller, the bank teller whose testimony had helped convict Wilson and Burton. Mrs. Hawkins continued to run the household with efficient affection, having taken to grandmotherly duties with unexpected enthusiasm. "He's going to be a natural horseman," Riley declared as James bounced happily. "Just like his mother." Grace laughed. "I hardly think my ability to stay on a horse qualifies me as a natural." "You rode through the night with Thomas to the line shack," Riley reminded her. "That's more than many born in these mountains can manage." "Fear is a powerful motivator," she said, joining them on the grass. "And I had excellent teachers." Riley lifted James high in the air, drawing more delighted giggles before settling the baby in Grace's lap. "Speaking of teaching, the school board asked if you'd consider returning next fall. They're expanding the schoolhouse and need an experienced teacher." Grace considered the offer. She loved teaching, but her life at the ranch with Riley and James had brought a different kind of fulfillment. "Perhaps part-time," she suggested. "I don't want to miss too much of James's childhood." "Whatever you decide, I'll support you," Riley assured her. He lay back in the grass, one arm behind his head, the picture of contentment. "Though I must admit I like having you here." Grace smiled, leaning down to kiss him lightly. "I like being here." As James crawled across his father's chest, babbling happily, Grace reflected on the strange twist of fate that had brought her to this moment. The memory of the gallows would always remain with her, but it had faded with time, overshadowed by the joy she had found in her new life. "What are you thinking about?" Riley asked, catching her contemplative expression. "Just how quickly life can change," she answered. "How one moment can alter everything that follows." Riley sat up, cradling James against his shoulder. "Do you ever regret it, coming to Silverton?" "Everything that happened," Grace considered the question seriously. "The fear, the jail cell, the trial, those I could have done without. But they led me to you, to this." She gestured to encompass their home, their son, their life together. "No, I don't regret it, not when I see what I would have missed." Riley's free arm encircled her waist, drawing her against his side. Together, they watched the sun sink toward the mountains that had become their home, painting the valley in shades of gold and rose. "We should get this little cowboy to bed," Grace said eventually as James's eyelids began to droop. As they walked back to the house, James nestled securely in his father's arms and Grace's hand tucked into the crook of Riley's elbow. She found herself offering a silent prayer of gratitude. For second chances, for justice, for the courage of a man who had ridden into town to save a stranger and found a wife instead, and for the love that had bloomed in the most unlikely of circumstances, proving that even in the darkest moments, hope could arrive unexpectedly, sometimes on horseback, with proof of innocence and the promise of a future neither of them could have imagined.